The ships were carrying the landing troops to Novorossiysk. The Marines were sitting along narrow passages between the railings and bales and boxes on the deck. It was the beginning of 1943. After the Stalingrad battle, which became the turning point of the war, the Red Army started an offensive trying to reach the Azov Sea. It was the beginning of 1943. There was an impending threat of strategic encirclement for the German troops in the whole Caucasus region, and soon the Black Sea Fleet and the infantry launched an offensive. It was the Marines who were destined to become one of the main actors in the forthcoming battles, to liberate Novorossiysk, and after that, Crimea. The Marines were coming to liberate the cities of the Black Sea. Yuri Porish, Grigory Zimakovsky, and others in Naval Infantry of the Liberators series. By the beginning of the Second World War in the Soviet Union, there was no naval infantry as a separate branch of troops. However, the Winter War against Finland proved the necessity of such troops. In 1940, the first separate Marine brigade was formed in the Baltic Fleet. Command of the brigade was commissioned to the officers, graduates of a general service school who had received additional training in the fleet. Before the beginning of the war, this brigade remained one of a kind. The newly formed troops had neither clear organizational structure nor training program. Moreover, the mobilization plan of 1941 did not involve deployment of the naval infantry forces. Large-scale formation and training of the new landing troops started after the beginning of the war. In July 1941, the 3 new Marine brigades were formed in the Baltic Fleet, and 3 more appeared by autumn. The naval infantry brigades were hastily being formed in the Black Sea, Northern, and Pacific fleets. Each brigade comprised of 3 to 6 battalions, 1 or 2 cannon battalions, mortar elements, and service units. 2 of the brigades even had tank battalions, which ensured a greater striking force. The brigades were formed from the military personnel of the coastline defense units, mobilized reserve Marines, and volunteer Marines. The fleet admiral, Nikolai Kuznetsov. 500,000 Marines were fighting on land. Naturally, this number would have been impossible if there had not been soldiers from the ships. All the generations of Soviet Marines, from ship boys to senior people, were seeing active service. After a short-term general service training, the Marines were sent to the front. By autumn of 1941, the Red Army was reinforced with 25 naval rifle brigades. The naval infantry had the following tasks. During an offensive from the sea, it was to occupy enclaves and retain them until the major forces arrived. During the defense campaigns, it was to cover the naval bases from land. However, from the very beginning of the Patriotic War, the Marines often had to perform the functions of regular rifle units, with the only difference: they were sent to the most dangerous areas of the front lines. For us, the Marines, it is natural to fight to the last ditch, as there are no retreats from a ship. That's why on the land, we were placed to the positions of no retreat as well. In a great part, it was for the Marines who, in the decisive September days, did not let the German troops take Stalingrad in stride. Great hardships were suffered by the soldiers of the 4th Separate Naval Infantry Brigade. At the night of September 20th, the battalion, together with 2 rifle regiments, forced a 600-meter water barrier under hostile fire. The soldiers on the left riverbank seized control over the bridgehead, which they named Nevsky Piatachak. As Yuri Porish recollects, few people could stay long at that site and return alive. A day or two, a week maximum, and then an inevitable wound or death. 8 days of my presence at the Piatachak passed under the constant fire from our side and the German counterfire from all types of weapons on our trenches. At times, breakthrough attempts were conducted by one side or the other. We could only have 2 or 3 hours sleep a day. The Nevsky Piatachak was no more than 1.5 square kilometers. But this tiny bridgehead remained the only hope for a blockade, running for a long time, because a few kilometers separated it from the Volkovsky front. The Soviet forces retained the Piatachak till the end of April 1942. Only once did the Germans manage to capture the bridgehead back. It was in the period of the Neva spring ice drift. But already in September, the bridgehead was regained by the Soviet landing troops, which retained the Nevsky Piatachak up to the very blockade running. 7 naval rifle brigades faced the attacks of the Germans in the Battle of Moscow. Marshal Zhukov recounted later. In the Battle of Leningrad, as well as in the Battle of Moscow, the naval rifle brigades won honors and, to a great degree, contributed to the success of the Soviet forces. The heroic defense of Sevastopol became a true triumph, and at the same time a great tragedy for the Black Sea Marines. On October 30th, 1941, when there were no overland combat units remaining, the city was defended mainly by the naval infantry forces, with the fire support provided by the coastal batteries and naval guns. The Marines retained the city until the arrival of the troops of the Soviet Coastal Army and other reinforcements. In the course of the 3 November weeks, the enemy made several attempts to capture Sevastopol, but all the attacks were defeated. By that time, the whole of the Crimea territory was under control of the Hitler Army. Thus, Sevastopol became a besieged fortress. The reinforcements, ammunition, and food supplies could only be delivered by sea or by air. The unsuccessful siege of Sevastopol by the German army under the command of General Manstein lasted for 250 days. On June 2, 1942, the German forces started heavy artillery bombardment and then passed over to the attack of Sevastopol. Only on the 10th day of the attack, the German troops managed to seize major portions of the defense ring. Since then, the delivery of reinforcements and ammunition to Sevastopol became impossible. Only after a month of fighting, when practically all means of defense were over, Admiral Oktyabrskyi, commander of the Sevastopol defense, got the permission to start evacuation. According to the Stavka's order, about 700 officers were evacuated by submarines. Some 1,000 soldiers were left by the light fighting ships of the Black Sea Fleet. The last defenders of Sevastopol, having no possibility to leave the city, continued the fight for 2 more days. According to different estimates, about 40,000 Soviet soldiers were taken prisoners. The unprecedented defense of Sevastopol significantly affected the further course of the war. The 11th German Army and 80 heavy and super heavy batteries stayed near Sevastopol for the first half of 1942. Although, according to the plan, they were to participate in the decisive attack on Leningrad. If this had happened and the Germans had captured Leningrad, it would have resulted in the fall of the Baltic Fleet and more complex situations along the whole front line from Murmansk to Moscow. Defending Sevastopol, the Navy infantry, in fact, defended Leningrad, Moscow, and Murmansk as well. In the course of the war, the naval infantry was turning into a self-sustained branch of troops, with most of the soldiers having the training of the Red Army Marines. The Red Army professional commanders had taken a 5-year college course before the war. They studied shipping, navigation, ship internal arrangement, sea flight tactics, and thoroughly mastered their nautical skills hand in hand with ordinary sailors. The students of nautical colleges were given good practical skills. During training cruises on different types of ships, they were taught how to tie up cargo and so on. The students had practice on training ships and in the last years of study on warships. practical trainings ensured good physical shape and strong will. As Nikolai Amelko recounts, one day, 2 14-paddle longboats were brought and we heard the order. Students on boats. We made about 15 kilometers. We had tired arms, water blisters on our hands, and we did not give up. When we reached the shore, we rested a little and went back. We returned at dusk and could feel neither our hands nor feet, but there were no complaints or whining. Quite the opposite, we were proud. Ordinary soldiers should show excellent practical skills as well. The soldiers transferred to Naval Infantry from ground troops had a hard time there. Some of them had to overcome nausea. As Vladimir Uspensky recollects, we had radio operators suffering from seasickness for many years. The organisms just could not get used to such conditions. Sometime later, I was surprised to learn that my commander also was not feeling well during rocking, but he kept a hold of himself and always took over his watch on time. Such practical skills as special amphibious training, landing on the territories occupied by enemy, and others the Marines received already in combat units. The training included familiarizing with amphibious landing crafts, mastering of the techniques for landing and putting ashore of soldiers and equipment onto the landing sea crafts and ground transport. Caesar Kunikov, commander of the intelligence service of the Naval Infantry, chose the location with steep beaches and rocky shores for mock landings. His soldiers practiced in rock climbing, grenade throwing from different positions, and sound shooting. The soldiers were taught how to make trenches fast, walk on the pebble blindfold, assemble and disassemble any weapon, including the captured one, with the eyes bandaged. The soldiers learned to throw knives. The Marines got the skills on mine laying and mine sweeping. They could render first aid. Today, such troops are called Special Forces. The soldiers are being trained for several years, while in 1943, these skills could be trained only during the periods when the combat situation allowed. It was not a rare case when even naval intelligence officers received missions after only a brief training course. Viktor Leonov, twice hero of the Soviet Union, recollects. After breakfast, the sergeant leads us to the mountains and shows us how to crawl and cam up among stones, throw grenades and bayonet. In 2 days, he tells, "Guys, you are good. Of course, you should be taught more and more, but we have no time. At night, we are marching out." The Marines always remained seamen. Even in rifle units, they never took off their striped vests and caps, thus emphasizing their Special Marine status. Albina Gentimarova, Cavalry of the Order of Glory, 2nd Class. When performing developing attacks, all of them put on their caps, took ribbons in mouths so that the caps did not fall. Everybody had their straps and striped vests on so that it was seen that these were the Marines coming. The Germans were afraid of the Marines, really afraid. Because of the black pea jackets which the Marine raiders wore in battles, the enemy called them the Black Devils or the Black Death. As Grigory Zamakovsky recollects, they brought us military outfit, but everybody refused to put it on. We considered this gesture from supply officers as an offense against the fleet, and so we used to go forward as black targets in a big field. Thus, we got our name, the Black Death. During the defense of Odessa, the Marines were among those fighting to the last ditch. These were the Black Sea Marines. As Grigory Zamakovsky recollects, I remember on our first attack till the present day, we were advancing by thick lines, shoulder to shoulder, standing up. A sailor in the second line was playing the harmonica. The Romanian artillery was firing at us, and we were marching as if it was a parade. The day before it had been raining. There was mud all around. We should have fallen onto the ground, but did not want to stain our new uniforms. That's what we were thinking at the time. Death seemed unreal. On September 22, 1941, the Soviet command was planning to make a combined attack on the Romanian forces near Odessa, to land one group of Marine raiders in the vicinity of the Grigorievka village and perform a para-dropping in the rear of the enemy. There were no airborne forces near Odessa, and the commanders had to employ the soldiers with minimum experience in parachute jumping. But everybody had ready to volunteer, even the Marines who had never seen either a parachute or an aircraft before. The success of the landing near Grigorievka was amazing. After the attack of the Marines from the sea and from the air, 2 Romanian brigades were completely destroyed. The enemy was pushed back some 5 to 8 kilometers from Odessa. The main weapon of the Marine Raiders was machine gun, but the range accuracy of the PPSH guns, Spagan submachine gun, was no more than 200 meters. That's why, besides machine guns, the Marines used SVT-40 Tokarev self-loading rifles. This semi-automatic rifle had the accuracy range of 1.5 kilometers. The first deliveries of SVT-38 rifles were directed to the Red Army forces fighting in the Winter War of 1939 and 1940 against Finland. During combat, such drawbacks of the rifles were big size and weight, sensitivity to contamination and low temperatures became apparent. As Boris Vasiliev recollects, SVT was sensitive to sand, water, everything. If you put it on the sand, then you had to disassemble it and clean. Otherwise, after the first shot, the ammunition feed would stop. It was a very unreliable rifle. The emotions of the Marines, exhausted from daily marches for many kilometers on the issue of these rifles, were far from positive. Weapons designers improved the rifle, and soon it turned into one of the best of its kind. No worse than the American M1 Garand rifle. The Russian rifle was even better, as it was easier to load and had a larger magazine capacity. Moreover, SVT-40 excelled the early German self-loading rifles of the G41 series. The negative attitude to the SVT was rooted in insufficient general training of the greater part of the Red Army common soldier. The SVT required more thorough attention and delicate handling than a usual rifle. It was difficult to teach the wartime recruitees to handle the rifle in a short period. That's why the rifle was effectively used only in the units with more technically competent and prepared personnel. Elite military forces, such as the Naval Infantry, used the SVT rather successfully until the end of the war. It was valued for a greater firepower if compared with the Mosin rifle and for high rate of fire. Lev Pushkaryov, the Marine soldier, recounts, "It was calculated. After the combat on the site where I defended my position, there were 11 dead bodies. That had been the performance of my SVT." Both the Finns and the Germans set high value on the captured SVT. The Germans even adopted it as a weapon of limited application and handed it to their soldiers. Joseph Ohlerberger, one of the best German snipers, wrote, "The SVT-40 was a reliable weapon. It considerably intensified the fire rate of an experienced sniper. In general, the SVT-40 was one of the best self-loading rifles of the time, for no reason underestimated by the Red Army." The total number of the produced SVT-40 amounted to 500,000, including about 50,000 pieces of the sniper version. The naval infantry paid big attention to the cold steel and the ability to use it in combat. Major Kunikov, for example, required that his soldiers could manage knives and daggers no worse than firearms. Vice Admiral Georgy Kolostyakov. Besides a machine gun and grenades, every raider should have had cold steel. It turned out to be not as easy a task to provide it to some 300 soldiers. It was not one of the government-issued weapons. We had to organize the Dragger manufacturer. In the forge of the Gelendzhik machine and tractor stations, the daggers were made from old car springs and then sharpened on hand grinders. Cold steel was used not only in hand-to-hand fights, but for hitting of an enemy from the distance as well. The raiders were taught to throw the daggers at targets. I saw how well Kunikov himself could do that. In the beginning of 1943, the Soviet forces were finishing the liquidation of the Polis's army under Stalingrad. The Red Army troops were advancing to Rostov and Donbass. An offensive campaign in the Maykop direction was being prepared in the Caucasus. According to the Stavka's resolution, a plan of attack on Krasnodar was elaborated. It consisted of the two parts, the mountains and the sea. The first part included advancing into Krasnodar and liberation of the city. The second part, the sea, included attack performed by General Petrov's Black Sea Group from the ground and simultaneous landing of the Marine and Airborne forces. The units were further supposed to advance to Novorossiysk. On January 11th, 1943, the plan was adopted. The mountains operation was started the next day. By January 23rd, the Soviet troops had breached the German defense line to the south of Krasnodar, and thus they cut off the retreat of the German troops from the northern Caucasus. The Red Army reached the Azov Sea and captured Maykop. It was time for the sea part of the campaign. The plan provided for the landing of the main troops in the vicinity of Yuzhnaya Ozerika and the demonstration troops near the Cape Mishkako. The mission of the second group was to disorient the enemy, make it look like a broad front operation. The main group, under the command of Colonel Gordiv, consisted of 2 naval infantry brigades, a rifle brigade, a separate front air service regiment, a machine gun battalion, a tank battalion, and an anti-tank artillery regiment. The secondary group, under the command of Major Caesar Kunikov, was made up of only 275 Marines with no heavy armament. These were really excellent soldiers. Before the landing, they had taken an intensive amphibious training course on the special field near Gelendzhik. On the Kunikov's request, he was provided with the captured German guns, machine guns, carbines, and the corresponding ammunition, as well as German grenades. The commander taught the soldiers to manage the enemy weaponry in case of deficiency of their own ammunition. Under the cover of fire from the ships and with support of the aviation forces, the Marines were to land ashore, beat the enemy's opposition, and unite with the airborne troops. The start of the operation was planned on February 4th, 1 a.m. Vice Admiral Oktyabrysky was in charge of the operation. Vice Admiral Vladimirsky was the commander of the fire support from the ships, and Counter Admiral Basisti led the landing craft carriers. The landing groups were located in 3 different ports, which caused additional difficulties for the performance of their simultaneous transportation to the landing area. Problems started from the beginning. During shipping of the first landing group in Gelendzhik, the departure of the ships was delayed due to bad weather conditions for an hour and 20 minutes. At 1 a.m., Basisti informed about the delay and asked to postpone the preparation fire for an hour and a half. At the same time, he informed the commander of the operation. Vladimirsky, the commander of the fire support group, ordered to all his ships to put off the starting time, not waiting for the order from Oktyabrysky. As a result, the fire support group approached the shore and did not start the fire, thus revealing the landing site. Having learned about the delay, Vice Admiral Oktyabrysky ordered to start the fire according to the plan, but the order was not received on time. Aviation did not receive any orders referring to the changes of the plans at all and performed the bombardment of the enemy's positions and parachute landing as it was planned. The firing from the ships did not prove as effective as it had been planned, and the enemy's weapons were not destroyed. That meant that the latter would inevitably be put into action, but the Marines did not know that yet. The important forces of the Black Sea Fleet participated in the operation. Among them were the Red Crimea and the Red Caucasus cruisers, the Kharkov flotilla leader, destroyers and gunboats. The landing of the first assault forces was to be provided mainly by MO-4 warfare crafts. 30 light American Land-Lease tanks of the M3 Stuart series, meant to reinforce the first landing group in the vicinity of Yuzhnaya Ozerika, were carried by 3 Bolander-powered barges. Each of them transported 10 tanks and 2 trucks. The barges were hauled to the landing sites by minesweepers and then the Alupka. Yalta and Gelendzhik tugboats were to tow the Bolanders to the shore. At the night of the landing, a strong wind was blowing from the sea. The ships took their positions, but the barges were proceeding very slowly, and all the rest of the ships had to consider that. The main forces of the Marine raiders were to land under the cover of the ship artillery. But by the time the troops reached the landing site, the artillery preparation had already been over. The motorboats with the landing troops approached the shore. They were lighted by the German searchlights and fired from cannons, mortar guns, and machine guns. The shore was retained by a Romanian division and a German battery of 88mm anti-tank aircraft guns. Under the fire of these guns, the Soviet gunboats did not manage to approach the shore. The landing troops were literally being fired from the ground. The fascist forces were protected from the fire of our cruisers by the mountain slopes. We jumped into the ice-cold water of the Black Sea, some of us from gangway, others overboard. The tall soldiers were in the water up to the chest, and shorter ones were practically underwater. The seamen hurried to carry the ships away from the field of fire and nearly pushed the soldiers and landing officers from the ships. Having lost all the barges and 20 tanks, the seamen managed to push ashore some 10 combat-capable Stuart tanks. 1,500 Marines that made only a part of the first landing echelon also landed. As Fyodor Monasterisky recollects, upon landing, the soldiers got under heavy fire. The searchlights were throwing lights on the figures of the soldiers running among the explosions into the depth of the shore. The tanks which had come ashore stood frozen, shot by the enemy shells. Some of them were on fire. The same was with the tanks on the Bolanders. The latter became the target of the enemy artillery fire as well. The quay was crowded and other ships could not enter it. The enemy cannons and machine guns were positioned on the southern mountain slopes, rising right over the seashore. Kunikov reported to the command by a radio message in plane. The regiment has successfully landed. We are advancing forward. In this situation, the command resolved not to continue the operation and recalled the ships with the main landing forces. In spite of that, the group of Marines which had landed ashore managed to reach the enemy's flank and the rear. The commander of the German air defense battery lost the nerve and ordered to explode the weapons and retreat. This demoralized the Romanian soldiers. Many of them started to run away. The others yielded themselves prisoners to the Marines. The Black Devils won the landing combat, but the ships with the main forces were already on the way back to the ports. In the meantime, the Marines seized control of Yuzhnaya Ozerika. After some rest, the seamen resumed the attack and by the end of the day reached Glebovka and occupied its southern territories. The Germans drew to this area the forces significantly exceeding the number of the Marines: a mountain battalion, a tank battalion, 4 artillery and 2 anti-tank squadrons, air defense weapons. When the group of Marines realized that there would be no reinforcement, they retreated to the shore in the direction of the Abra Lake in the hopes to meet guerrilla bands. The other part of the landing troops decided to battle through to the Cape Mishkako. At the same time, the actions of the Kunikov's secondary landing troops proved to be more successful. After the ships carrying the first echelon of the landing troops had come at the estimated time, they started the preparation for the artillery strike. The mortar boats stood frozen, waiting for the signal for landing. The Kunikov's detachment had neither cannons nor tanks.
Десантники были вооружены автоматами, снайперскими винтовками и
The raiders were armed with guns, sniper and anti-tank rifles. Each soldier had 800 rounds, 8 fragmentation grenades, and 1 anti-tank bomb. Their clothes were worn trousers, cotton-wadded jackets, high boots, helmets. Each soldier had a white bandage so that he could be recognized in the darkness.
в темноте.
The first artillery shot from the head ship sounded, and right after that, dozens of naval guns opened fire on the shore. A purple-yellow glow rose above the sea. The motorboats carrying the landing troops set off to the shore. Under the machine gun fire, the soldiers of the Red Fleet were jumping into the ice-cold water and rushing to the shore. Hand-to-hand fighting started in many places along the coastline. Already, in 10 minutes, the first line of the enemy's defense was breached. In an hour, the landing was finished. The Hitler forces retreated and took the position behind the railway embankment, maintaining resistance. Kunikov sent the following radio message to the command in plane. The regiment has landed successfully, advancing forward, waiting for reinforcement. The plane radiogram had specific, previously set meaning. For the Soviet command, it served as a signal for landing of the second echelon, and it disoriented the enemy, which most certainly had picked the message up as of the number of the landing troops. Only 275 soldiers instead of the whole regiment landed on the Cape. The mortar boats went to pick up the units of the second and the third echelon, and in a few hours brought the soldiers onto the occupied bridgehead in Stanichka. A little more than 800 soldiers landed during the night in total. Nikolai Starshinov recounts. Kunikov ordered to collect all the captured weapons and established a unit which immediately got an informal name of the Separate Amphibious Captured Munition Division. When the Germans realized that the landing forces were not really great, they started responding with the blows on the defense line occupied by the Soviet soldiers. At this point, the Captured Munition Division showed itself. Its weapons stroked the enemy tanks and mobile guns, swept the attacking Hitler soldiers by fire. The Marines retained the bridgehead, and the command decided to consider it as a base. This bridgehead on the Mishkako Cape was destined to become history under the name Malaya Zemlya. Reinforcement was sent to the Malaya Zemlya, and the landing troops decided to take Novorossiysk by storm. However, the 47th Soviet Army, which was supposed to conduct an attack along the eastern coast of the Simis Bay, was stopped by the German troops. And by March 1943, Novorossiysk was not liberated. The battles for Malaya Zemlya continued for 2 months. The Marines succeeded in extending the bridgehead, but even after that, its territory was 8 kilometers from the west to the east and 6 kilometers from the north to the south. A part of the 18th Army forces and light T-60 tanks were carried to the Malaya Zemlya. For this purpose, the improvised seagoing ferries were used, the latter being the combination of the 2 DB motorboats. By this time, there were some 17,000 people on the bridgehead. But the landing troops were positioned on the open and easily targeted locations, while the Germans preserved control over all the surrounding heights. In order to cut down the losses resulting from constant firing, the soldiers had to conduct enormous pioneering works. The whole of the occupied territory was trenched, including the rocky plots. There were 230 concealed observation points, more than 500 firing positions, and underground storages. The command office was positioned in a rocky shelter at a 6-meter depth. The wounded soldiers were evacuated to the rear by the motorboats at night. The dead bodies were simply put aside. It was impossible to dig graves in the rocky ground. In the middle of April, the Germans launched the Neptune operation aimed at elimination of the bridgehead on the Malaya Zemlya. For this purpose, the General Wetzel's group of 27,000 soldiers, 500 guns and mortars was formed. Some 1,000 aircrafts provided air support. 3 German submarines and the flotilla of torpedo boats were to destroy the communications between the bridgehead and the Caucasian ports, and thus cut off the supply support for the Malaya Zemlya. The Germans started the attack on the Malaya Zemlya on April 20th. Right on that day, the Stavka's aviation reserves were deployed to the Kuban. This air support enabled the Marines to hold the positions on the Malaya Zemlya. The battle had been lasting for 5 more days before the German command realized the failure of the Neptune operation. The Germans started to withdraw the troops to the initial positions. The raiders had been holding the positions on the Malaya Zemlya for 4 more months. Only in autumn 1943, the Soviet troops developed a new campaign on liberation of Novorossiysk. The key part of the campaign was large-scale amphibious landings right in the Novorossiysk port. For these purposes, 3 new landing units and 1 support unit were formed. The latter included 4 groups. A breakthrough group commissioned with elimination of firing posts on the quay piers, a group of the coastal attack, a group of the attack on the port, and the group covering the operation from the sea. The landing troops had 150 warcrafts, motorboats, and support ships of the Black Sea Fleet. Vice Admiral Vladimirsky, the fleet commander, performed the general command of the operation. Counter-Admiral Kolesniakov was in charge of the landing. On the night of September 10th, the raiders boarded the ships in Galenshik. A few hours later, when the ships reached the orienting line, the preparation fire started. The Soviet aviation forces reinforced the fire. The landing craft carriers set off for the assault objectives. 9 torpedo boats of the breakthrough group attacked the German firing posts on the quay piers, blew up the barriers, and gave the signal that the port was open. At the same time, another 13 torpedo boats attacked enemy objectives on the shore. Some minutes later, the 3rd group of torpedo boats rushed into the port. They launched torpedoes to the quay and the landing sites. Within a few minutes later, the boats carrying raiders entered into the port. About 4,000 people landed ashore. The quick success of the operation was hampered by the fact that the forces attacking from the Malaya Zemlya direction and those advancing along the eastern coast of the Tsimis Bay did not manage to occupy large territories during the first day of the battle. As a result, the naval infantry units fighting in the ports and the units fighting in the vicinity thereof were isolated from one another and had to act being encircled. The next day, the second echelon of the amphibious troops landed in the Novorossiysk. Then the main forces of the 55th Guards Rifle Division and the 5th Guards Tank Division were put into the fight. Novorossiysk was liberated on September 16th. Evgeny Morozov recollects. In Poland, the 3 of us captured 25 Germans and an officer's map case with secret documents. We sent the documents to the headquarters, then received a radio message. to award a commendation to the intelligence officers. The deputy chief for political affairs told our commander, "The soldiers have done a good job," then put them forward for the Order of Glory. The Order of Glory was established in November 1943. It was awarded for personal bravery in the face of the enemy to the soldiers in the rank no higher than junior lieutenant. The Order of Glory has 3 degrees, 1, 2, and 3. The first is the supreme degree. A person initially received the 3rd degree and then subsequently was promoted to the 2nd degree and finally the 1st degree. The cavalries of the 3 degrees attained the next rank. Full cavalries of the Order of Glory had the benefits equal to those of heroes of the Soviet Union. 4 full cavalries of the Order of Glory were granted the title of Hero of the Soviet Union. Among them, Senior Artillery Sergeant Alyoshin, Junior Lieutenant of the Air Force Drachenko, Sergeant Major of the Guards Dubinda, Senior Artillery Sergeant Kuznetsov. 4 women attained the full cavalry status. Sniper Sergeant Petrova, Machine Gunner of the 16th Lithuanian Division Stanalini, Medical Sergeant Nazdracheva, Air Gunner and Radio Operator of the 99th Separate Guards Intelligent Regiment of the 15th Air Army, Sergeant Zhirkina. (2,620) were awarded with the Order of Glory First Class, 46,473 with the Order of Glory Second Class, and 997,815 with the Order of Glory Third Class. The Crimean offensive, which soon began, ended with the complete destruction of the 17th German Army, the latter suffering the losses of over 140,000 men. The liberation of the Crimea relieved from the threat the southern wing of the Soviet-German front line, and the Soviet forces regained control over the major naval Black Sea base, Sevastopol. Odessa was liberated. The Marines paid back for the bitter defeats of the first war years and decisively proved their importance both at sea and on land. A year still remained till the end of the war. The Naval Infantry and the whole Red Army continued the liberation of the motherland.